At the start of the year 2048, wars raged across the world. The global economy had collapsed. Billions were on the edge of starvation. Refugees fled the tides of battle. The internet was at best unreliable in terms of connectivity, and even providing useful information about the goings-on across the world, it was almost useless. And the seas were becoming filled with desperate pirates. With such a decline in the state of the world, it seemed unbelievable that the planet had not yet hit rock bottom. By the end of the following year, the body count had more than doubled. Civil wars brewed in several major powers, and the tides of war in several theaters had turned. With the growing realization that the war to the south and the west would not be as simple as once thought, China made a major push against the Southeast Asia allies and forced the bulk of the Chinese army into Laos and Vietnam. This move was supported by the Chinese fleet, which saw success after several major engagements. They even managed to land a substantial force on Taiwan, seeking to resecure the land. The goal was to knock the countries in Southeast Asia out of the war quickly, and then move west into India, avoiding the need to oust the Indian army from Tibet. However, pulling more of the forces back from the western fronts allowed the Indian army to gain gains in that theater, including the liberation of Xinjiang, effectively giving the Indian Pact a staging ground for attacking western China. Throughout 2048, Japan continued to avoid direct confrontations with China. However, as they continued to fight the Russians to the north in a limited capacity, they began to up their forces in Vladivostok and South Korea. Also, after the sinking of the Philippine fleet, Japan began lending the island nation assistance and materials to quickly rebuild. This build-up by Japan and the distraction of the Chinese southern front, keeping the Chinese army sparse in Manchuria, inspired the semi-autonomous North Korean Military Council to force the issue in late 2048. Despite the warnings provided by the agreement signed between Russia and the European Union against the use of nukes until someone else in the world used such a device, North Korea used 3 such weapons to cut a hole through the demilitarized zone between North and South Koreas. Their forces moved quickly through the devastation and pushed through in the east. Similar action was attempted in the west. However, South Korean intelligence defused the bombs before the bombs could be used. This likely saved the city of Seoul from destruction. The incursion into South Korea was met with a swift counterattack, but the primary battles continued to rage at the close of the year, with the North holding on to a small foothold in South Korea. With the conflicts with their neighbors piling up and the death toll rising, unrest began to build southern and eastern China. The promise of quick victories was becoming to be understood as a lie. The populace, which had up until a few years previous enjoyed a high standard of living that had since collapsed due to the global economic implosions and the isolation of China due to the war, was growing increasingly unhappy. Dissident movements, most of which had been forced underground after the previous would-be revolution, began to gain strength once again. The war between the European Union and Russia continued to rage in 2048. Seeing their lines in the south falter and their main forces in Poland being slowly pushed back, the Russians attempted a few unusual strategies to snap the European strength. The first was a series of suicide paradrop missions deep in EU-held territory to destroy major military manufacturing and robotic control centers. Of these desperate moves, this was the most effective as it severely slowed the European advances after gaining important strategic victories. Another was an attempt at propaganda and theatrics to try to make it look like Turkey was aiming to join on the Russian side. Turkey, which had avoided the wars and had taken up a hard neutrality stance as the world spiraled out of control, quickly caught on and made it clear to the EU what the Russians were attempting to do. And that finally, the Russians attempted a massive invasion of Sweden, originating from the Baltics, using mostly civilian ships to make the crossing. This attack was a disaster. The Russian fleet had managed to nominally maintain control of the Baltic Sea. However, the attempt at subterfuge was caught quickly by the EU intelligence systems. As the hundreds of small ships attempted to speed across the sea, carrying mostly infantry and small robotic fighters, the European Air Force quickly descended on the boats. Very few made it back to shore, and only 2 made it to Sweden. The soldiers who landed were quickly captured. However, despite a string of victories, not all was well in Europe. The ongoing war had cost many lives and left the East devastated. Anti-war protests filled the streets in every major city. The general message was not surrender, but a conclusion of hostilities as soon as possible with a return to the status quo from the pre-war days. As elections began to roll through the EU, new politicians began to take power who reflected this desire. And at the end of the year, with news of the use of nuclear weapons in Korea, new fears were ignited as now the pre-war agreement to avoid the use of nukes was technically not in effect. It appeared likely that if the EU pushed too far into Russia, the response wouldn't be troops, tanks, robots, or drones, but nuclear missiles. And despite advances in anti-missile technology over the years, there was still no guarantee that most, or even any of the missiles would be stopped before impact. With the growing momentum on many fronts, the Islamic Democratic Union seemed well poised to end the war against the United Islamic Nations. What more, with the goodwill gained from the African Democratic Federation, as well as the military assistance that came with, it seemed a victory was all but guaranteed. However, even as the UIN was falling apart in the Sudan and Afghan theaters, a realization was made of the Islamic Democratic Union leadership that peace would not come to the Middle East, and particularly not to the IDU, until the other wars raging across the globe were brought to their ends. Knowing that they would hardly be able to tip the balance in some regions, they understood that they were well positioned to bring an end to the Iranian-Saudi-centric conflict. And so the Islamic Democratic Union made an agreement with the Iranian-centric CRA that would bring the Union in to assist the CRA against the Islamic Alliance, in exchange for a peace agreement and the formal alliance between the two superstates. The CRA, having lost total control in Yemen, Syria, and Lebanon, thought they were near defeat by mid-2048, and thus eagerly accepted the treaty. The Islamic Democratic Union made quick moves into alliance-held territory near Jordan, seized Damascus, pushed into Sunni-dominated North Iraq, and entered Eritrea. These attacks caught the Islamic Alliance off guard. The containment of the Iranians in Kuwait and the UAE fell apart as the Saudis scrambled to counter the IDU's attacks. The CRA sped across the Saudi desert, and by year's end they had taken Riyadh. While the democracy and freedom-supporting Islamic Democratic Union was seeing success, so was the Grand Republic of Africa, ruled over by President Kunda and his brutal regime. After the fall of Tanzania and the securing of Kenya, his forces in the east turned up and down the coast, pushing north into Somalia and south into Mozambique and Malawi. The front soon expanded as armies conscripted from the newly secured areas were tossed against Ethiopia and the former GRA ally of Zimbabwe. The Kunda also kept up on his push into South Sudan, chasing the fleeing remnants of the government north into Sudan, occupying land along the way, pressing the local men into service, and pillaging the countryside. This soon brought them into contact with the Islamic Democratic Union, which had pushed south through most of Sudan, engaging in much less brutal military actions. Despite insistence from the GRA's ambassadors, once the remnants of South Sudan's government had fled north past IDU lines, the GRA army did not cease its pursuit. In December 2048, the GRA and the Islamic Democratic Union were trading fire. The gains in the west by the GRA were less dramatic, mainly due to the Nigerian acquisition of Cameroon and the remnants of the United States military in Angola. However, both blocs to the GRA began to falter. The Americans in Angola found themselves being withdrawn as things spiraled out of control in North America. By October 2048, the withdrawal had stalled as military air and sea travel from the U.S. ceased. This left thousands of U.S. soldiers in Angola, desperate to help the Angolans keep the GRA from moving in and killing them all. The GRA had made examples of almost the entire militaries of Kenya and Tanzania, killing most of the late surrendering soldiers as encouragement for their enemies to surrender early instead. And so it was clear to both the Angolans and the remaining U.S. troops that given the resistance they had given thus far, they'd be given no quarter. This inspired many to bravely fight throughout 2048, and despite dwindling numbers, they managed to hold back the GRA's onslaught. Nigeria was not as successful, despite having a numerical advantage compared to the GRA. Having never faced a conflict of this scope or nature in recent memory, the Nigerians were caught flat-footed several times, leading to a string of defeats and the GRA troops entering southern Nigeria. Though a formal agreement had not been signed by the end of 2048, South Africa had managed to finally pull together a unified front against the GRA. South African troops flooded into Zimbabwe and Mozambique, and they were soon joined by more from Botswana, Namibia, and Madagascar. The GRA troops sieging Beira in Mozambique were surrounded and destroyed. Harare, Zimbabwe, was similarly relieved several times in the chaos of the conflict. And finally, late in the year, reinforcements arrived in Angola. However, despite some early successes, Nkunda's military machine was far from defeated. In March of 2048, the Brazilian stall in Paraguay came to an end, but it was not due to a sudden success of the country. It was a result of a massive military campaign across the continent to disrupt the supporters of Paraguay, as well as any others seen as an ongoing threat to Brazil. Though the attacks were not unexpected, the overwhelming success of them, even against the militarily well-prepared Peruvian and Argentine militaries, did come as a surprise. President Sousa preached to his loyalists about a Latin American empire, the purging of inferior ideologies, and the eventual unification of the Western Hemisphere under Brazilian-centered government. However, despite his vile and enthralling rhetoric, President Sousa was soon overshadowed by the general leading the Argentine campaign. General Magro became a sensation in Brazil after a series of victories, all filmed by her personal film crew, and featuring atrocities as the prime focus of the videos. The videos were sent back to the propagandists back home, and soon she was hailed as the Missile of Brazil. Whispers soon came to President Sousa that perhaps General Magro might return and try to assume his position. The total disintegration of order in the United States was in the end hampered by the underlying federal structure of the nation, even as the boldest moves against President Lee's government were also provided by the same structure. Early in 2048, after the first rounds of bombings of major cities across the country seemed to come to an end, a number of states had already de-recognized President Lee, his government, and all the Patriot Party-controlled parts of the federal apparatus. Some of the de-recognitions were explicit, such as those made by Alaska, Illinois, Vermont, Florida, Texas, and the 4 western states that immediately after declared themselves the Western Alliance against Lee. Other states avoided the bold declarations and instead quietly had transitioned away from Patriot Party control, some of them in very bloody fashions. The seizure of the Iowa State House was particularly brutal. Though not explicitly secession, as all the rebellious states all made it clear that they were not leaving the Union, it was de facto such, as military and civilian federal employees loyal to the cause of their home states began to follow local direction instead of that of the Lee regime. As the summer simmered, Lee ordered a fresh wave of attacks, focused on the rebellious states. However, given the fracturing of the militaries between Lee loyalists and anti-Lee forces, Lee's Air Force was not alone in the sky. Still, the Patriot Party still had a solid base of support from over a quarter of the country, making an easy account of what areas were under Patriot Party control difficult. However, Lee's biggest base of support remained in the South, the Farm Belt, and the areas under federal occupation in the mid-East Coast. Observing the futility of standing alone and the easy successes of the Western Alliance to band themselves together and effectively fight off Lee, several states began to similarly band together to pool resources. Some agreements brought strange bedfellows, such as Utah and Colorado. New England as a whole had unified their military command by the end of 2048. The deterioration of control across large sections of the country and his own growing instability led Lee to seek alternative solutions to destroy, as he called it, the unsavory rabble. With the nuking of the Korean DMZ, Lee, no longer fearing the consequences of letting the EU and Russia off the nuclear leash, decided that there would be an option he could use to end the rebellion. Orders were sent to target the U.S. nuclear arsenal at rebel-controlled areas across the country. The orders were given to fire. But not a single missile launched. Despite the indoctrination of most of the remaining federally controlled military assets into the ideology of the Lee administration, no one followed the orders. A few attempted to, but were stopped before the launch sequence was completed by their own compatriots. Despite the hate and the fear, enough people in the right places decided that no, their homeland should not be glassed on a lunatic's order. The year 2049 was a turning point in the East Asian conflicts. The fatigue and ravages of war on the various nations engaged in the fighting pushed several to the breaking point and beyond. The fighting between China and the Indian Pact simmered at a lower level for most of the year as the Chinese army focused elsewhere and the Indians struggled with supply lines. The Chinese maintained air superiority over the main portion of the front, further slowing the Indian and defensive pact's advances through the rough terrain of the Tibetan Plateau and the regions beyond. India's government began to falter in its resolve to continue the fight as most of Tibet was liberated from Chinese occupation. With the Indian advances slowing, China continued to focus on Southeast Asia for most of 2049. Though advances through Vietnam were slow, and Myanmar managed to make gains against the Chinese army, pushing back into China, Laos's army was completely destroyed, and the nation fully occupied by mid-year. China moved into Cambodia and Thailand soon after. However, due to fierce resistance and trouble elsewhere, the Chinese were pushed out of Thailand by year's end. The Philippines, with a new Japanese-sponsored fleet, again had success in seizing islands from China in 2049. Though not as contentious as the fight for Taiwan, Hainan still mounted a great deal of resistance. Though this was not the most impressive victory for the Philippines. After taking Taiwan, the Southeast Asia Pact was able to make contact with several major dissident organizations on the mainland. The Philippines quickly diverted a portion of their military hardware to these groups, arming them in preparation for the fight to come. In September, after a series of riots in Hong Kong and a subsequent crackdown by the Chinese authorities, an alliance of the dissident groups used their new arms to strike at the occupying military elements. As the city slipped out of military control, the central government quickly moved to increase its military presence in the surrounding areas and other major cities. This, however, again made these deployed units vulnerable to the well-armed rebels. By year's end, numerous cities had been cleared of government influence and the military presence either destroyed, captured, or defected. Though the rebel groups were not fully united, they did understand their common purpose, and so avoided infighting as the major groups began to take control of large swaths of China. The start of the conflict on the Korean Peninsula the previous year constituted a fourth front to the regional conflict. The rash moves by the North Korean satellite proved quickly futile, as after the initial success of pushing across the DMZ, the North Korean forces were trapped by the South Korean and Japanese forces, with only the still very dangerously footprints and the nuclear weapons they used to cross southward as their only means of escape. And so, due to a mix of danger and retreat, and the century of propaganda that had been fed to the North Koreans, it wasn't unexpected that they sought to hold their ground. And though they may have outnumbered their opponents, the technologically superior South Korean and Japanese forces managed to still overwhelm the expeditionary force by midsummer. By fall, the defenders had gone on the offense. With the fighting with Russia dying down in the north and the main bulk of the North Korean army broken, South Korea and Japan began to make moves into North Korea and Manchuria. China, beset by innumerable problems elsewhere, struggled to reinforce their wayward satellites and their northern defensive lines. The Chinese military was in a panic at year's end. Conflicting orders from Central Command to either keep up the fighting or to retreat and deal with the rebels paralyzed divisions. Hundreds of thousands of troops began to be ordered in circles as different voices from Beijing began to shout orders down the chain of command. Rumors that some in high positions had defected to the rebels began to circulate. Most such rumors were untrue, but it did result in generals in the field actively ignoring some orders until clarity could be regained. The complete breakdown of command was finally halted in late December, when a unified statement from the Military Council was put out detailing the few defections and calling for a unified front against the enemies of China. The Council also issued standing orders for the fronts of the conflict in case of future command breakdowns. The reason for the subsiding of the intensity of the Russian front in the east was due to the Russian Federation's last-ditch effort to push back the Europeans. With the collapse of their lines in the south, a plan was hatched to force a ceasefire. The bulk of the Russian army moved on Poland, and over the course of the year they pushed back the EU's forces, taking Warsaw and sieging Krakow. The effort was intended to disrupt the EU's southern efforts via flanking, or failing that, make a strike into Germany to break the will of Europe's populace and continue the fight. The Russian president saw this as the only way to avoid giving in to the hardliners on his side, who were intent on turning the war nuclear. Once one side fired such a missile, it was likely the end of not just Russia, but the whole world. But the offensive began to fall apart. The need for long supply lines, which had long protected Russia, had begun to work against them, and the Europeans turned back the offensive. With the westward push done, and the Ukrainian, Georgian, and Armenian troops moving into the south, nearing Moscow, it seemed that the button would be pushed. But the Europeans understood what continuing the onslaught could bring. Nagel, the president of the EU, offered up an ultimatum. Russia would surrender with a few conditions. Among them would be the withdrawal and abandonment of Russia's territorial ambitions in Ukraine, breaking off ties with the rest of their alliance, and a massive reduction of Russia's military capabilities. The peace offer was rejected on the insistence of the hardliners. This rejection, however, was later understood to be an opportunity by more moderate voices within the government to discredit the hardliners. In October, with the situation growing more grim, the moderates struck. Senior officials who had insisted on rejecting the peace deal were arrested and executed. The coup d'etat also took out the Russian president. The moderates wished to avoid nuclear war at all costs, though they were divided about surrender. And so, with the new leadership in place, the Russian government continued the war and began planning for the next clever offensive. In the Middle East, it appeared that the war between the Islamic superstates was nearing an end. Saudi Arabia was nearly fully occupied by 2050, with the Islamic alliance's remaining forces retreating mainly to Yemen. Eritrea on the other side of the Red Sea had fallen early in 2049. Syria and North Iraq capitulated soon after. Only the odd one out of the Islamic alliance, Uzbekistan, remained mostly in free occupation, and only because of the remaining difficulties in pacifying Afghanistan to the south. The only drama seemed to be the Islamic Democratic Union and the CRA's race for the Holy See of Mecca. The IDU was in the end beaten in that race, but did manage to hold Medina. Negotiations for how to handle the holy cities post-war began not long after. Despite several attempts at bringing about a ceasefire with the Grand Republic of Africa, President Kundas seemed eager to deny or outright break the agreements made with the Islamic Democratic Union. The GRA's troops pushed north into Sudan, beating back the war-weary IDU army. With fears growing that the GRA might soon enter Egypt and the war in Arabia winding down, the IDU requested extra support from the CRA and African Democratic Federation. And the extra support from the African superstate came with some conditions, namely that the IDU would need to host a peace conference within 4 years to attempt to bring the fractured and warring states of the world together in one place to end the ongoing chaos. The IDU was happy to agree to this. Despite successes against the IDU, Nigeria, and the near full occupation of Ethiopia and Somalia, President Nkrumah's focus was not on the northern fronts. His seemingly endless armies focused in early 2049 on Angola. The remaining American troops were mostly forced to retreat south or to go into hiding. Those that hid would continue to harass the GRA for the remainder of the conflict. Those that fled south alongside the remainder of the Angolese army were soon joined by Namibia's army as the GRA quickly moved into Namibia's rural areas. Zimbabwe surrendered early that year. Botswana and Mozambique were pushed nearly to the same by year's end. Seemed only South Africa would soon remain. But South Africa would not go down without a fight. Finalizing a series of agreements with Namibia, Mozambique, and Botswana, the militaries of the four nations fell under a common command and control. The first major test of the United South African Army came with the GRA siege of Gaborone, Botswana. With Johannesburg within a short drive, it was clear that if Gaborone fell, the core of South Africa would soon be under assault. The fighting in late 2049 in and around Gaborone devastated the city and the surrounding countryside. However, by October, the allied South Africans were repulsing Nkrumah's army. One of the reasons for the repulsion was due to air superiority. Allied South African drones bombed the GRA lines constantly for weeks, destroying most of the GRA armor and their few robotic forces. At the end of the year, Nkrumah had experienced a major loss, and his southern army was in disorder. With most of his troops by this point recruits harvested from conquered areas, it wasn't a surprise that in the retreat many deserted. Some sought to return to their homelands, others surrendered to the Southern Alliance. The battle for South America saw successes from both sides. In the north, having to deal with supporting troops on the far side of the Amazon, it wasn't a surprise that in 2049 the Brazilians saw a number of setbacks. By mid-year, they were fully expelled from Venezuela and Peru. The lines in Bolivia shifted back and forth. Argentina had some success with an invasion of Uruguay, but suffered major losses elsewhere as General Margo's army continually outmaneuvered the Argentine military. Taking cities and towns that seemed at first to be strategically unimportant, but then using these unassuming positions to strike at the Argentine forces, Magro was able to keep the pressure up on the Argentine military. And so throughout 2049, Argentina slowly lost ground to the Brazilians. Still, General Magro failed to encircle Buenos Aires as she had desired. Requests for more support from President Sousa's government were ignored, as the Brazilian president began to hope for the general to be cornered and killed in the field. Historians later pose that if not for the distrust between the Brazilian president and the general, General Magro could have defeated Argentina and allowed for the Brazilians to push north and west with their full forces, possibly leading to a quick conquest of South America. Despite the wisdom of those with the keys to the United States nuclear arsenal, the Civil War in the U.S. was far from over. President Lee's government continued to lose control throughout 2049. By May, most of the military had turned. Some divisions switched only after bloody purges of Lee loyalists. No longer shackled to Lee's commands, which grew more and more outrageous each day, the rogue military leadership began to align with some of the Allied state groups. For the most part, this resulted in several of the Allied states to expand their state numbers, seeking strength and protection against the remainder of Lee's forces. 3 major state alliances formed up this way. In the west appeared the new Western American Alliance. In the Midwest, the Central Allied States. And in the Northeast, the Northeast State Pact. However, there was one grouping of states that was much more aggressive in their expansion. Governor Franco Diaz of Florida made good use of its growing support from the defected U.S. military and the help offered by several experienced retired military commanders that flocked to his state after the start of the chaos by invading the neighboring states. Most of the South had remained loyal to Lee due to the strong base of support for the Patriot Party. Diaz, who was seen as a reluctant rebel by many of the region, quickly won the support of the populace as he ordered the destruction of Lee-friendly state governments. By year's end, however, with most of the South under Floridan control, Diaz made a move that would change the dynamics of the North American conflict. Floridan troops moved into western Texas. Texas had the previous year broken with the Lee regime and was widely seen as one of the major players in the fighting against the Lee loyalists. And so they were caught flat-footed as Diaz seized several major cities. In late July, the Texan government had surrendered to the Floridan army. A few weeks later, Diaz attacked the Central Allied States. A few weeks later, the new Western American Alliance. And a few weeks later, Oklahoma. Though their main fight was still against Lee's government, now almost entirely isolated to the central East Coast, Diaz seemed eager to reunite the United States under his rule. Though not giving his regime any particular name, the rest of the country began to describe Diaz's holdings as the Florida Empire.